Welcome to the Anxiety at Work podcast. I'm Chester Elton, and this is my co-author and dear friend, Adrian Gostick.
We hope the time you're going to spend with us is going to help remove the stigma of anxiety and mental health in the workplace and in your life. And with experts from around the globe, we want to provide ideas and tools to deal with anxiety in your world.
We're delighted that you've chosen to spend some time with us today. We love our community and delighted to introduce to you our new friend. Our guest today is Shannon Huffman Polson. She is the founder of the Grit Institute and one of the first women to fly Apache helicopters for the U.S. Army as a captain and pilot. Seriously, how cool is that? Shannon earned her MBA at Dartmouth and worked in the corporate jungle for several years, including a stint at Microsoft, before writing some successful books, including The Grit Factor, that just came out in September of 2020 with the Harvard Business Review Press. Her organization, the Grit Institute, trains leaders in skills critical for individual and team success, focusing on courage, compassion, and commitment, with the emphasis on grit and leadership in times of challenge and change. And we are definitely in a time of challenge and change. Welcome, Shannon, to the podcast. We're delighted to have you here.
It is so great to be with you. Thanks so much, Chester and Adrian.
Well, again, welcome from me too, Shannon. And what an amazing background you have. And we're so glad to have you on the show. In your career, you've worked in obviously some male-dominated workplaces, from the U.S. Army. You worked in medical devices industry, Microsoft. What advice can you give to women and others who are trying to build their resilience, but maybe they find themselves in an old school environment that is a little slow in changing?
Sure. Well, the first thing is, of course, to read The Grit Factor. I wrote that exactly for those people and for others as well. But, I'd like to really think about when we're facing challenges, whether they are institutional or whether they are situational, that it's really important to go back to the basics. And I talk a lot to groups about the commit phase of the Grit Factor, which is the work of owning our own story and drilling down to core purpose. And those are both a lot harder to do than they might sound, because it's work of really, really deep introspection. What it is that makes up your life. What is the raw material of your life that you have sometimes asked for and sometimes not asked for? What have you learned over the course of that about your core values, about your beliefs? That really are those things that you can come back to and anchor in when times are really challenging. And I think that's really, really important work to be able to do.
I love that idea of own your own story. What is the story? How did you get here, and what is your purpose? It's really interesting. In our new book, Anxiety at Work, we talk about how the U.S. Army has decided to train soldiers and even their families in this resilience training. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So why is grit and resilience so important, not only to those that go to war, but those of us that are in business?
Yeah, absolutely. And I draw a lot on that work from the University of Pennsylvania Positive Psychology Center that is the underpinning of the Army's Master Resilience Training Program in the Grit Factor, in the section that talks about building grit and resilience. Because I think one of the things to start with is the understanding that grit is not something just for fighter pilots and big mountain climbers. Grit is innate to every single one of us, and it can be built and it can be trained. And it's important because, Angela Duckworth defines grit as passion and perseverance towards very long-term goals. I have thought of grit as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances. And I think both are really important when we face challenge and when we face change. In terms of the actual practices of building, there are many of them. They tend to be small practices. They're small, regular practices. And some of those practices include writing down what you're grateful for at the end of every day. I think for people in faith communities, that might be praying. And for those who are not, then it might simply be writing those things down and then speaking in your mind to really what makes you grateful for those things.
Yeah, when you talk about gratitude, that's our wheelhouse too. We love that idea.
Yes.
Where, you can't be in a state of gratitude and a state of anxiety at the same time. I love how you talk about those simple, small practices, and obviously reducing anxiety and stress in the workplace. As a fighter pilot, as a woman in a man's world, and building your career, writing your books and speaking, what are some of the small practices that you personally use to tamp down anxiety and eliminate stress?
That is a great question. One thing is ensuring that you're making time to take care of your physical being that the rest of you is living in, and that is taking time to get outside and get fresh air and exercise. Making sure that you're eating healthily, and I will say, by the way, that I fail on these all the time. So these are aspirational in some cases when things get really tough, and it's also taking time to reconnect. For me, I have a faith practice where there is prayer and there is connection to particular readings that are really meaningful to me, and that's a helpful grounding that goes back to those core values, goes back to that core purpose, reminds you what is at your heart, and allows you then to operate in the world outside of that. So I think those are all three really important things. And I do think that both starting and ending the day with that connection is a really important thing, for at least in my life.
Oh, that's great. And by the way, just so everybody knows listening, we are never going to argue with anything that Shannon says, because she can take out not only us, but our entire house. She knows how to fly and attack helicopters. So this is really cool.
But I would never do that, of course.
Of course not. Of course not. I love that. Hey, speaking of a little bit about your background, I love that in addition to earning your MBA, you went and got an MFA, Master of Fine Arts, to learn maybe more how to write. Yes. And in the Grit Factor, of course, you tell your story, and you encourage us all to know our story. So tell us a little bit about that process for yourself, how you came to find your story, maybe where you struggled with that, and what that means to us.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not only wanted to be a writer, but also have been writing my entire life. So it's one of those funny things when you publish your first book, and my first book is called North of Hope. The Grit Factor is my second traditionally published book. People will ask, well, how did you do this? How did you come to this? And how did you write this? And I said, well, I've been writing my entire life. This has always been the goal. This has always been the dream. So it didn't come out of nowhere. But at the same time, the practice of that is challenging, and it's a lot different than writing your college essays, right? And that was where I think giving myself permission, and this is again honoring the heart and the core purpose of giving myself the permission to go back and do that MFA, partly recognizing that I wanted that focused time, and I wanted to honor that dream that has been with me for my entire life, and that is going back and looking at your life story. And part of it, understanding that leadership truly does involve a huge creative component as well. I really believe that. And so having an opportunity, and I continue to do this, to continue to work to cultivate and build the creative part of my life, because I think that is a part of how we relate to people, and relating to people is what leadership is about. So that is, going back for the MFA was part of owning my story, was part of saying, when I was 12 years old in junior high, I wrote in my little book that I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be an artist. And it was honoring that, as opposed to continuing, full speed ahead in the corporate jungle, which is great for some folks. But
So what does that mean for us then? How do we learn from you? If we're in business, how do I learn to know my own story?
What I like to recommend to people is to go back and do a lifeline, or what is sometimes called a journey line with one of my clients. And you write out a line with all of the major events of your life. And what's considered major is totally up to you. So write down what those major events are. Positive is above the line, negative is below the line. And then look at those places also where there are inflection points, where something changes in your life, for positive or for negative. And then go back over that line and assign values to each of those things. Say, hey, what did I learn, and what value came out of that? What can I understand more about my personal values? So that's 2 or 3 passes through this lifeline, writing the events down, understanding what you learned, and understanding what value was articulated by that. And then start to look at those groupings and say, hey, here's these values that come up again and again. These are the things that I want to draw on. These are the things that I'd like to leave behind, because you don't have to take everything with you. You have to recognize them, but you don't have to take them with you. And then I think there is a more thoughtful way of saying, how do I align my life and the choices that I make with these values that I've identified?
That's really interesting. That reflection, we hear that so often from leaders. Reflect on what has gone before. Reflect on what you learned and what are you going to carry forward. That's really what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is reflection that you don't just do once. Ideally you're doing this as a regular part of your life because those understandings will continue to evolve and to change.
You know, our focus on the podcast is to really help people manage their mental health, the anxiety and the stress while progressing, professionally. What advice can you give for people who are struggling with their anxiety and may even be hiding it at work?
Gosh, it's such an important question, and I'm so glad you're having this conversation because I think a lot of us are really wrestling with this. It really does depend on the work environment in terms of what you're able to share at work, I think, but it is also important just to step back. And I've said this more and more recently. The grit factor doesn't address this, and it probably should, to be quite frank, that at the end of the day, grit is not a sustainable operating mode, right? It's an important characteristic, but it's not sustainable. And it's something you have to develop, but you shouldn't be in that all the time. And I think for a lot of us, we have been, especially in this last year. And that is incredibly anxiety producing. So what I recommend is really to understand that you're a key part of the equation of your success, and you've got to be able to take care of yourself in order to take care of others. I'm a mom of 2 boys as well, and so it's work, and it's also a lot of other little humans that are dependent on me. And I realized, halfway through this pandemic thus far, that I was not taking care of myself, and I was increasingly less able to take care of them in the way that I wanted to. So step back. Recognize that it's not about deserving. Of course you deserve it, but you really need to take care of yourself, your physical self, your mental self, in order to be able to contribute in the way that's most meaningful for you. So give yourself that space, that permission, and that opportunity.
That's terrific. Kind of start with yourself. It's putting your own mask on before you help others. One of the concepts in your book is turn your nose to face the wind. I'm guessing there's a story behind how you learned that, maybe with a few bumps along the way. And then probably the second part of it is, how does that help us in our business lives?
Yeah, and it's my favorite metaphor. And I actually recently came across the fact that I think Henry Ford may have said something similar. So of course, anything great is borrowed, right? But what I like to talk about I keynote and I talk to audiences around the world on leadership and grit. And one of the things when I start out my presentation, I talk about the first time I walked out towards the Apache helicopter. And it's crouching there on the tarmac at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I walk out on this winter morning and I'm completely intimidated by what's ahead. And I climb in the cockpit, we taxi out for takeoff, and I'll ask audiences in a live audience, which way do you take off in the Apache helicopter? And most people will say up, which is of course a good guess and is the ultimate goal. But in the Apache, like in any other aircraft, you turn the nose to face the wind. And when you use it the right way, the resistance will help you to rise. I think that aviators, as well as boaters, can understand the importance of facing something head on and not taking a wave to the side, not taking the wind to the side. But we don't do ourselves any favor when we avoid what the challenge is. I think the real importance is facing towards it and moving through it, despite the discomfort, despite the challenge, knowing that that's making us better in the process.
So great. The resistance that helps you rise. I love that. So in the Grit Factor, you also talk about being yourself, but yet being adaptable. How do those ideas work together in building stronger mental health?
Well, that's a great question as well. And I think it is agnostic of the time that we're in, because this is true at any given point, that being authentic and leading authentically to who we are is so important. Now, for those who are minorities in majority fields, that can be a very difficult thing to do. There is a tendency for many of us to put on the mantle of wherever it is that we are. And some cultural adaptation is necessary, but anything that is inauthentic to your core purpose, to your values, is ultimately damaging. So I think being authentic to who you are and how it is that you navigate the challenges that are ahead of you at work or at home or anywhere else is critical to your mental health, because we're made to be the people that we are, and we're able to contribute the most that we possibly can in the way that we're meant to contribute only when we're true to the person that we are.
And it's interesting. We hear a lot from people who say, I really wasn't authentic because I was afraid of telling people who I was.
Yes.
Whatever it is within us that we were afraid to share. Typically, people assume something way worse than that. So sometimes it's just better just to sort of, as you say, be authentic. But how do you get this idea of adaptability in there? Because if we're being ourselves, should we be rigid within ourselves? Or tell us about that idea of adaptability.
Yeah, and adaptability is multifaceted. I would say it relates to how we present ourselves authentically, but yet understanding that there is some cultural component of any given group or organization that we're going to need to respect at least, and make sure that the place that we are working or the place that we have chosen to work is aligned with our core values. So we're not in violation of things that are important.
You were one of the first women to ever fly Apache helicopters. You walk into a place that, really women have never really been before. And in your work, you help a lot of women or others who feel underrepresented.
Yes.
So as leaders, how can we maybe better understand the problems that underrepresented groups may be facing? And how can we become a little better ally as leaders or others in business?
That's an important question, and I'm so glad you're asking it, because it really is a challenge that is for all of us, and not certainly for the less represented group. I would say that one of the things that you can do to be a better ally is to tell stories that include all of the people in your group, that represent all of the people in your organization or all of the people that you want to be in your organization. And if you don't know those stories, go out and learn them. They're not often told enough, but you can learn them and you can share them as a leader, and you have a responsibility to. And I would say that is the number one thing. And the number two thing is really making sure that there is mentorship for those people in those roles, understanding that they're facing double challenges, or what I call what a Stanford law professor calls the double crucible in many cases. And in some cases, there's a triple crucible when you add other areas of intersectionality in that. So mentorship and sponsorship can help a lot with some of that challenge of that kind of an integration.
Shannon, we were talking offline about your experience in the Army and being one of the first women to fly the helicopter. And you said, because I was a bit of an oddity, I didn't necessarily experience that camaraderie and that teamwork that, had I been a man, for example, would have gotten.
Yes.
Was there somebody that stepped up at a certain point that was your ally that helped you become inclusive?
Yeah, I would say I worked, the Army, because it's a huge organization, is really a bell curve, right? You have some of the best people in the world, and you've got the other end of the bell curve as well. And so, yes, I worked with some of the people that I would, I'll never have a chance to work with folks like that again. Right. And my first platoon sergeant who worked for me was actually probably the person that I would hold up first in that example. And he supported me. He would argue with me behind closed doors, but ultimately, if I didn't change my mind, he'd go down and pretend it was his idea with the soldiers. I mean, he was just exceptional in every single way. And frankly, I couldn't have done it without him, right? None of us do this alone. And I'm so grateful for that being my very first opportunity to lead and having that kind of support in the process.
This has been just such a fun discussion, Shannon. If people want to learn more about your work or the Grit Institute, where would they go?
Yep, I'm online at shannonpolson.com or thegritinstitute.com, and also fairly active on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. So I'd love to see any of you at any of those places.
Excellent. It's interesting. You talked about your staff sergeant. I think I got that right, or your support.
Yes.
And, I love that you said we would argue behind closed doors. And yet when we came to agreement, that creating of a safe place, right? A safe place where you could argue, where you could hash things out. And it is really incredible, isn't it, when people have a safe place. But it is also really common that people suffer in anxiety and they suffer alone, right? So what are some of the ways that leaders can bring awareness around mental health and that safe place to their team members, especially those that may be more in need than others?
Well, I think the first thing is, and Adrian, you brought up something that alluded to this earlier, is that leaders can be vulnerable more today than they have ever been able to be. I think much more so than when I was serving in the Army. And share your own struggles and your own challenges. I would also say sharing stories of people who overcame those challenges, whether it's most powerful if it's your own story for sure. But if it's somebody else that's close to you, sharing those stories I think is critical, and letting that be a conversation that is continued, that you both facilitate and in fact champion at regular intervals so that people feel comfortable sharing that.
It's so interesting you're talking about this being vulnerable and, being authentic. I'm trying to picture the Army culture and this, this stuff. The staff sergeant coming out and being vulnerable, and I don't know. There's a little cognitive dissonance there. So, how did that work in the Army? Did you find that there were Army leaders that really were vulnerable in front of their troops?
Well, so I've been out of the Army for 20 years, so it's a bit different now. I will say, no, I did not find a lot of that. But I do think that I'm now engaging still with a lot of other folks that are still serving. And I do see a lot more of that than I expected. And I'm so grateful for it. I think it's critical to the mental health of our military and hopefully sets an example for other leaders as well.
Well, this has been such a fantastic discussion. Now, Shannon, if you had to summarize our discussion today and maybe a few ideas for business leaders out there, what would they be? How would you if you're, you have an elevator ride with me and I'm a new leader, what 2 or 3 things would you tell me to help me build more grit, resilience in my team?
Yeah, I would say the same things apply for the work that you need to do for yourself as what you can facilitate for your team, first of all. And one of those things is doing that work to own your own story. They can reach out to me. I can lead you through that at the Grit Institute. The Grit Factor will also walk you through some of that as well. But owning their own story and connecting to your core purpose. I mean, the studies are pretty clear that when leaders do this, when employees do this, they are more engaged, they produce better results, and they have greater longevity. It's exactly what you want in your team, right? That kind of engagement at a time when engagement is at a low. So I think that's a really important thing to do as a leader and to help your team do as a leader. The second thing is to facilitate those opportunities to take care of yourself and encourage your team to do the same. I've heard real concerns and also success stories of leaders setting boundaries, for example, on the time that people are working online, because that can stretch interminably and some people are working many more hours than they were in the past. So putting boundaries on that and making sure you respect them both for yourself, because that's what you model to others, and then also encouraging your team and maybe even requiring your team that there's no emails after 6 p.m. There's no emails before 7 a.m. Putting those boundaries on so that people can take care of themselves and their families, I think, is a really incredible opportunity to help to shepherd their own mental health and that of their team.
Excellent. So tell us again, where can we find more out about you? Where can we find your book? Give us all the details.
Great. Yeah, the Grit Factor is anywhere books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, or your local independent bookstore, which I always like to encourage that you support, especially in these times. And I'd be happy to send you a signed sticker if you reach out to me at shannonpolson.com or on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram.
This has just been a delight. Thank you so much for your time, for your energy. It's interesting. The podcast is called Anxiety at Work. And sometimes I think people think, oh, this is going to be really deep and it's going to be sad. And it's not. It doesn't have to be. And so we appreciate your positivity, your sense of humor, and dare I say, grit in getting this all done.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chester. Thank you, Adrian. A real honor to be with you today.
Well, Adrian, I mean, what a delight. What a delight to have her on the show. And as we said, remarkable service to our country, climbing in an Apache helicopter, breaking down barriers, showing true grit. A lot of takeaways, but I'll toss it to you first. What were some of your key takeaways from our podcast today?
And it's often small things, and that's what Shannon said. There are small, regular practices that will help you reach your long-term goal, like her daily gratitude, journal. Simple little things, right?
Yeah, I love what she said on that. Start and end your day in a positive way. get out and go for a walk, exercise, eat well. I also love that she admitted that she wasn't perfect in doing that every day.
Yeah.
We hear this from people, oh, they do it every day. Aren't they amazing? Give yourself a little forgiveness. Start your day and end your day. And I'm with you on that. Small little things over time help build up that resilience.
And to that point of I'm not perfect, do you remember when we interviewed the captain of the Blue Angels,
Yeah.
the Navy's elite fighters years ago? And what he said was that after every performance, they remove their insignia of rank. They sit around the room, so there's no captain and privates. Everybody's the same. And they talk about things that went wrong in their performance. I was 50 feet off my flight line, this, that, and the other. And they're very honest. And you can call somebody out, too. And when you leave the room, we're all buddies. And so that idea of vulnerability and honesty being so important that we've learned from other really high-level military units.
Yeah. Those simple things, like you say, being genuine, I think tied back to when she said, know your story. That was such an important part, that reflecting back on your timeline, what was good, what was bad, what did you learn, what are you going to carry forward? And that you went through it 2 or 3 times, and that it was a discipline that you continued to do that. It was kind of like your true north. I thought that was really interesting in knowing your story. Where have you been? Where are you now? Where are you going?
And we do a lot of that, of course, in our What Motivates Me work, when we built the What Motivates Me assessment or the Motivators assessment. And what we have people do is very similar, where they look back at their timeline of their work. And I love what she said is you're assigning values. You know why I love this job is there was creativity in there. You know what frustrated me about this job was that there was no opportunity to grow. Or you start to realize what are your not strengths and weaknesses, but really what are your motivators at work. And I love that idea of you assign values and you figure out really what matters most to you at work. That will bring a lot of anxiety down.
Yeah. A couple more things she said that made an impression on me was nose to the wind. That resistance helps lift you. And I thought, because, often we go, no, I want the wind at my back. I want to cruise through this. And one other thing was, she said, get your purpose right. Your purpose is the raw material of your life. I thought that was just so well said.
That is great. I love both of those ideas. I love that idea about, put your nose to the wind is that so often we want to skirt around an issue. And she's saying, no, if you want to tackle it, you just have to hit it hard. You have to go right at it. Probably my last thing I thought was very powerful when she said, on this idea of stories, she says, all your people have stories and you need to go find them and talk about them. So don't just, I don't know anything about, Shauna or Dave. It's like, then go find something out about them and tell their stories. I love that.
Well, her book is The Grit Factor. Pick it up at a local bookstore, order it on Amazon. Wonderful story, wonderful woman, wonderful service. Just a delight to have her on the podcast. I want to give a special shout out to our producer, Brent Klein. We say he's the greatest online producer in the world, and I think we're selling him short, Adrian. He really is remarkable. Christy Lawrence as well, who finds all these wonderful guests for us. It's the straw that stirs the drink. And of course, all of you who listened in and gave us your time. Now, Adrian, if they love the podcast, what should they do?
Well, a very simple and easy way to support the podcast so we can continue to grow it is to download the podcast versus streaming it. That really will help build our audience and our reach. So thank you again to everybody who's joined. If you'd like to learn more, join our WeThriveTogether.global community. We've created a wonderful safe place there to talk about anxiety and mental health at work.
You got it. Follow us on LinkedIn. Listen to the podcast. Share it with friends and family. We're just delighted that you gave us your time today. Take care, and we'll see you next week.